of every day dealing with quota issues and dealing with email client issues. All of that changed in 2011 when Google offered us free unlimited storage and set us on the course that we're on today. You all know how voracious an appetite our users have for storage, and until now, they didn't have to say, they didn't have to even ask for storage. So I want to share with you my group's portfolio, and San Diego State has a strategy of cloud first. So if it's something we can do in the cloud, then we do that. And if you look, our enterprise application support, we have Google Workspace, O365 Azure, ServiceNow, Zoom, the learning management system Canvas, MediaSite, Adobe Creative Cloud, Adobe Acrobat Sign, Globus, crowd goes wild, Duo Security, Slack. And for our help desk services, my group provides help desk, desktop support, identity management. We do dual multi-factor, network and wireless troubleshooting, software distribution, Zoom cores, and ServiceNow cores. So we do a lot. So I wanted to take you through our cloud storage today, and probably the biggest is our Google Workspace. We have 76,000 active accounts using 1 petabyte of data. Our primary repository for PL data is Google. So we store our PL protected level information in both My Drive and Shared Drive. Also, Google is the campus standard for collaboration for faculty, staff, and students, having moved students from Exchange to Google in 2020. Microsoft OneDrive, used primarily for PC backup and folder redirection. Our users have a 1 terabyte allotment, and it's expandable up to 25 terabytes if they ask. And nobody's asked to date, just if you're wondering. And we have 43 terabytes of data in Microsoft OneDrive right now. SharePoint, 4 terabytes of data, departmental use only, students don't have access. So our long-term strategy is we're going to phase SharePoint out. Azure, we got a lot of stuff going on in Azure. I looked at the list, it's like this big. I won't read it all to you, but we have 356 terabytes of primary and backup storage. Azure replaced our traditional tape backup that was stored off-site. And finally, we have, 356 terabytes on Azure. And finally, we have Amazon S3. So these are projects requiring GovCloud, like our new DARPA grant. I think it's a $14 million grant that we have, and we're going to use the Globus connector to connect our data to GovCloud. And in Amazon, we have 43 terabytes of data currently. So what are we doing right? Also, how can you prepare for this unlimited storage? I think it all starts with having an automated provisioning, deprovisioning for your accounts. So we've done all that. We have feeds from our HR system and our student enrollment system that comes in, that puts the account down in Active Directory, and then we use Azure Directory Sync, and we use Google Cloud Directory Sync to sync our accounts out to the cloud. Staff volunteers and consultant accounts are deleted 90 days after separation. Faculty and students who are graduating have a 1-year grace period for academic continuity. Accounts for life are not created for our alumni. And finally, we do routine auditing of all of our accounts. So what are we working on? It's the appropriate retention policies. We don't have any of those currently, and in products like Zoom, that's gotten us into trouble. We have like a 54 terabyte limit in Zoom. I think it's like 80 something terabyte right now. So we're working on that. Consider how Google's new storage tools can be applied that they just released. So we need to figure that in. We're also training up and expanding our enterprise platform administrators. So I've added probably about 6 or 7 of my team that are now going to be administrators on that platform to help deal with these quota issues, user questions, and support when they arise. And then we also need to increase our user-based training and documentation because, like I said earlier, they haven't had to think about storage. So this is all new to them. Our future direction, well, SDSU prefers Google Workspace platform. Our users love the way that filing is shared, and they don't want to use any other platform. We're going to continue to use Globus with our Google and Amazon connectors for sharing our research data. And moving forward, we'll consider all storage options. It used to be, we'll just put it in Google. Oh God, we got too much storage in Zoom, move it over to Google and YouTube. But we're not going to do that. So we're going to think about things a little more careful moving forward. And what do we need from our cloud partners? We need additional add-on storage that is competitively priced and easily acquired, especially for our researchers. Tools for administrators and users and end users to manage their storage. And finally, we want better communication as it relates to changes and assistance with our implementation strategies. That's it for San Diego State. Helen?
Thank you.
Yep.
Hopefully I'm on. Yes, I am. can I click? Oh. So hi, I'm Helen Ziwa. I'm from Harvard University IT, and I work in a group called Technology Partner Services. In my role as Director of Strategy and Engineering, I help our team sort of think strategically about everything that we do, and I own the enterprise storage service. And in that role, I partner with other major storage providers across campus to think about the Harvard University storage strategy. And so bringing it back to Google, when we started out looking at Google, we wanted to find out, well, what are people using Google for? Because we have 1.8 petabytes of data stored there, even though we've had a strategy of sort of limiting who has access to Google and thinking that it was for a limited use case. So we found that 0.4% of our users are using 81.6% of the storage. So then we come to the conclusion that if we focus on these 0.4%, we should be able to get to a good place. And so we identified some use cases that we were not taking care of, right? And one of them we'll call medium-term storage. And I'll explain with a couple of use cases later on, but this is a place where people store large amounts of data so that they can maybe check it out and see which one is important, which one is not, to move finally into the final destination. And then sharing externally, it's extremely difficult for people to share from our on-premises systems. And instead of having to deal with that, what some people have done is leveraged Google's APIs to move the data up to Google and then shared it from there. And then archival storage. So there's some people who, after they've used they're done with the data, want to store it for some time. And free and unlimited storage is hard to beat. So that's where they put it. So then I have an overly simplified diagram here to show my interpretation of what I think has been happening or is happening right now. And when you see the picture, local storage, central storage, think about those as different, they're across campus, right? So there are major storage providers that would provide centralized storage by use case. So research computing in one instance, administrative use cases in another instance, and then local storage are all those servers that are distributed across campus. And very smart people have figured out how to leverage Google for all sorts of things. So they collect things there. They might crowdsource. Some media production folks, we haven't heard too much about those other use cases, so I'll talk about them here. They crowdsource event video from people, and they have them put them in Google so that they can pull them down and create a video later, and sharing and archiving. And who destroys data? Like, that's even not in the realm of possibility, so I'm putting it in its place. So I talked about medium-term storage. So the library is one big place where not everything that you get is important, and people donate things, and they need to collect that borne digital information somewhere so that they can assess it for the future retention. And so that one hadn't been talked about before. So I'll come to what are we trying to do with Globus, since we're at the Globus conference. So again, overly simplified, but I changed my picture to show that what we want to do is leverage Globus to expand access to other endpoints. So right now, all these storage systems are disparate and not connected in any way. And so we want to see if we could offer researchers or these other people who need a lot of storage access to various endpoints through Globus. Would that solve the problem, and is the pressure on Google? Additionally, we are looking from a storage strategy standpoint to help our users manage their data. There's not a lot of many user-focused tools to help users see what's important, what's not. A lot of the information that's stored on our most expensive storage is archival data, and people don't know it because they can't tell how long it's been since they accessed it. We're not even going to try to solve the destroy problem right now. And so I like quotes. And one of the quotes that I like is, if you ask the right question, you'll get the right answer. So my goal here today is to pose the questions that I have and to see what other questions I should be thinking about. So if AWS S3 Glacier Deep Archive is the cheapest storage out there, and we want to make it accessible to people to put their storage there, how do we protect them from getting the charges that might be incurred through retrieving if they're self-serving? What happens to shared data or files when users leave the university? And how do we provide insights into the data to help with data lifecycle management? Thank you.
Yep, which button moves it? Okay. All right, I'm Charles McClary. I'm from Indiana University. I am the manager of research storage, which is a department of research technologies where we provide all the HPC and storage for our researchers. I have a little different view from what the other folks have, and I'll share a little bit of that here. Our storage at IU, and I'll just rattle it off right here. We have a redundant HPSS tape library archive, which we total 354 petabytes. We have a redundant GPFS or Spectrum, IBM Spectrum scale storage environment with 7.2 petabytes. This mostly provides two services. One is the home directories for our supercomputing users, and it also provides what we call project space or collaboration space. This is sort of the big NAS system, it's not NAS, but it's a big NAS environment for all the university that users may access. And we also have a Lustre storage service that is directly tied to our HPC systems and only available to our HPC systems in just over 11 petabytes. Our data transfer methods on all of these storages, we do provide Globus on all of these for users to move data, as well as we provide these other clients, which are pretty typical across the board for access. On the HPSS world, I'll talk a little bit about that because that's the one that's near and dear to my heart. That's primarily with HPSS, HSI is their native client that they provide. And I would say over 95% of our connections to the tape library are via that tool. And we try to push more and more people to Globus where that makes the most sense. Our cloud experience at Indiana University was years ago. We bought into, you probably remember the exact date, but we bought into box.com and everybody embraced that like wildfire. And I think we had around 3 petabytes of data in it by the time we got to the point where we're saying, Box said, you guys, this is not unlimited anymore and you need to pay. You decided we weren't going to pay and decided to move. And it wasn't a, hey, let's get people under a certain amount of storage like a quota. It was, we were vacating Box in its entirety. And we had a team dedicated to moving the entire university, which was, how many users do you remember? 115,000, moving around 3 petabytes of that data. And there was no direction at the time in terms of which user had to go to, whether they go into Google storage or they go into Microsoft storage. So it went out to all those places. And so that was great. At the time, Globus had a connector for Box. We installed it, got it prepped, tested it, and ready to go just in case we had to use it. But the team that was involved with this actually found a tool, which I don't recall the name of the tool, SkySync. And I'm glad you're here.
I used to run Box for IU.
And so, and they did a great effort of moving everybody over to these other 2 platforms. Where we are today, as a lot of institutions are, Google's now said we're not going to allow you to have unlimited storage. And so now there's a sizable effort of moving and addressing the issues with cloud storage or the unlimited storage with Google Drive. Now we're taking a very different approach. We're not vacating it. We're giving people, the users, to the option to get under the quota limit of what is 5 gigs, get under it, get out, or what was the other option? Or pay for it. That's right. Somebody told somebody that at lunchtime. So so we do have the options for the users to decide to pay for it. And we're going to help facilitate that chargeback. So there's an effort and progress with that going on. Now, why I'm involved with this, I jumped in and volunteered on this project of the task force making this happen, is because since I am responsible for, or my team is responsible for the giant tape library, what I had nightmares with was people taking one folder from their cloud storage and dragging it straight over to the tape library. And all of a sudden 5 million files of size 1K are coming over. And then that user coming back about 6 months later going, I tried to ask for 1,000 of those files back and it's not happening. There's got to be a performance problem with your tape library. So we all know that that's just an unreasonable expectation to get it all to come back like that. But that's the thing I'm most interested in, is protecting. Why I'm part of this part of the project of the moving is to make sure that we identify those users who do want to move their data to our tape library or their storage, and we white glove hand each one of these users to make sure that they're moving the data over and set expectations of how that happens. And here's more babbling on about that. So the point here is we want to make sure people have ends up being a two-step process. That if they pull these small files out, they drop it somewhere on some spinning disk, they get a chance to aggregate it and then move it on to onto the SDA, onto our tape library. We are using Globus for that. We did prep a data transfer environment with the connectors for Microsoft and for Google environments to get the data into our storage system. So that's all I have. And I think Jim from Penn State is next.
Thanks. Can you hear me now? Is that nods?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the feedback. Okay, my name is Jim Leas, and I'm with the Office of the Associate CIO for Research at Penn State. And we're a sort of recently formed area of Penn State that reports both to the Senior Vice President for Research and also the Vice President for IT and CIO. So we sort of straddle that line between IT and the research. Next slide, please. So when I got involved in, and if you heard the IU story, we're probably about phase shifted about 9 months behind where they are. So we had to make a box to Office 365 because we're an Office 365 school, and you know, when the decision was made, it was one of these decisions. This is just another cloud storage, no problem. So I will say that we started with 143,000 accounts, and that sounds like a lot, but there were a lot. It was very long tail. There were a lot of them that had 8K in it, so we know that those people never used their box allocation that they were automatically given. But one of the astounding statistics about it was that the top 200 users out of that 143,000 had over half the space. We had about 3.2 petabytes when we peaked in box. And then the top 50% had about a third of the space, top 50 people had about a third of the space, and 46 of those 50 cases were people that are associated with the research mission of the university. So we knew that was going to be some tough ones. And then we also had 6 of the people were involved in the cryo-EM group, and they had about 700 terabytes of that space. So 6 people had another like 22% of the overall space. Next slide, please. So what we have now is we've gotten it down to actually about 200 accounts that still need to move, and those are the tough ones that need. We also have what we call a cleanup list, and these are mostly researchers where Office 365 is maybe not the solution, and I'll talk a little bit about the maybe part in a second. But the idea is we've got about 250 accounts that probably need either another box solution or another cloud solution to replace Box, or an on-premise solution. And I list some of the services that we're offering there. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we found when we first started moving people off is that workflows matter. And as a colleague of mine, and part of the problem of getting the tough cases off is that we have to replicate those workflows that worked so well for them in Box in the other solutions. As a colleague of mine said earlier this week, and we really need to help them do this, because we hire our researchers because they're very clever people, and they will figure out a solution regardless of whether we help them or not. And the Office of Information Security may not like that solution. So I go on off of her wisdom, and that's what I've been doing probably for the last 14 months. I've been helping the researchers and the tough cases migrate off of Box to something else. In most cases, it is Office 365, OneDrive, or SharePoint, but in many cases, we'd have to use the Globus connectors to move them into Amazon Web Services or Wasabi or some other solutions. And we realize that part of this is that workflows matter. So next slide, please. And then one of the things about Office 365 is that there are limitations on the design, like the overall individual file size, and that's greatly improved. But we also have limits on sort of the total volume of data, in that there's serious SharePoint limits to like 25 terabytes, and we have many groups that eclipse that in about 2 months of collecting data off instruments. And then we also have a path name problem. There's the total path name in OneDrive and SharePoint can only be 400 characters long. And a lot of researchers are clever, and they use their file and folder structure to convey metadata about the data collection, particularly off of instruments, particularly if they're a service bureau. So we've run up against those kind of limitations, and that's why we have to opt for some of the other solutions. And that's it. I'll turn it back to you, Bob.
All right, these guys are on it. I appreciate everybody setting a context here. As you can see, this is a multifaceted, I was going to say messy, but I'll be nice, multifaceted problem with a lot of complicating factors. I'm sure some of you have seen this, even if it's not your area, have seen this at your own institutions or organizations. And so I thought we'd just kind of lay out this picture. So I'm curious whether we'll start off and see if anybody in the audience has any questions to start out with. I've got some to prime the speakers, but I wanted to turn to the audience first, both in person and online.
So Carl Cornell at Stanford, and we're in the middle now of dealing with Box, and we're eventually going to have to deal with Google Drive as well. I have a question for all of the speakers specifically on Box. At the end of the migration, once you were finished, or if you're in the middle of the migration, is your target to not have Box accounts for anyone? And the reason I kind of asked that, or the follow-up, is if your target is no Box accounts for anybody at institution name here, how do you deal with researchers who come to you and say, I'm collaborating with Dr. X at institution Y, and they use Box?
I can take that one because we had to deal with it. So when an institution leaves Box entirely, the domain is quarantined for 6 months. They can set you up to keep your collaborations in place. You can't do anything in your account until you get access back to it. So it is possible. I had to do it when I was when they wound down Box at Indiana, because I worked with a lot of other institutions in exactly that kind of situation. So it's doable.
Hi, Mike Benedetto from the American Museum of Natural History. So as a museum, we're hoarders by nature. So don't destroy data, live it, breathe it. But we do have a problem, and one of the panelists mentioned the character limit, especially on Office 365 as you're moving to that. So, and I'm sure it's in some of the other clouds. So do you guys have some strategies that you can impart on how you kind of handled that? Or is it one of those, we'll get to it somewhere down the road kind of a question?
Yeah. So Jim, you brought that up. Do you want to take that? How are you guys dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And we met with a researcher last week about a website. Basically, he's in policy analysis. So we got a lot of the local ordinances by just scraping the websites of, the city of Richmond and the town of Northumberland and so on and so forth, and came up with basically replicating their web structure. And of course, as you know, that blows out the 400 character limit pretty early and often. And so what we're going to have to do with it, we've actually probably going to put him into Amazon, because he already has a compute and storage presence there. I mean, we just can't get beyond that 400 character limit. So setting up a SharePoint that's like the website that he's currently has that has box links in it just won't work. And so we've had to come up with some alternate things. The other solution was do it on-prem. And that's still a possibility too, is setting up a web server on our VM hosting, virtual hosting scenario, and setting up the web server there and replicating it there.
So something we've done with the Mike, there we go. Something we've done with researchers at Indiana University, again on one-on-one consultations, is because we've had, even on our local prem solutions, we do have path name limits, character limits. So we've worked with them to identify naming schemes that aren't so verbose, and help them with a system for metadata. They do have to now invest in metadata, which is always a pain, but we have gone that route to sort of add later on additional information, but do it via metadata, not just the file name, path name.
So I'm Jimmy from Duke, and one question I would have is, you mentioned white glove service, which sometimes I kind of think we might almost need to do that too for we're looking at Glacier, and that's something we might have to white glove any of the sort of archive. Could you talk a little bit more about what that means specifically?
So for us, white glove is we're going into the department's lab, working with them directly to figure out what their needs are. In cases like with moving out of a cloud storage, which in many cases they do, because the stats we heard earlier about there's only like 5% taking up 90% of the storage. That's the problem. And it's researchers who are just collecting so much data. It's an onerous task to get them to move. Plus they just moved, out of box. So our opportunity here is we do have tools like the data transfer network setup node we have for interfacing with Google, and for Microsoft. We don't open that up to everybody. That's something that's a tool in our hip pocket that when we go to a researcher, we say, okay, what do you have? How much is there? Do you have millions of small files, which invariably is yes. And then we allow them to access that where they can do the Globus Google connector and pull their data down to local storage, whether it's local or that spectrum scale storage service you saw, and then tar it up that way. And then they can use Globus to move it on to our tape library or wherever else they want it from there. So that's one of those ones we know we have to get involved because we're not letting them have access to the Globus Google connector without dealing with us. And I say white glove, but it's really, we're being very forceful about who has access to that, because we don't want that one folder to get dragged over that's, a million files, trying to protect our tape library.
So it's more of a white boxing glove.
Hey, Bob.
Yes, Jim.
If I could, and do I scare you? I look like Big Brother here. I'm looking at the room.
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. The background.
No, one of the things that we've done is we designed what we call a data interview. And I worked with a librarian that worked in our group beforehand. And we try to get a better handle on, the size of their data, what a typical run looks like, how many files does it generate, what size of the files. And so we talk about how do they share it? Is it mostly internal? Is it with the external? Is it anybody that wants the data? Is it for a contract from the NIH or the NSF? So we go through about a 40-minute data interview with all of our people that need sort of white glove treatment. And then we sort of cogitated on it for a while and then recommend a solution. So that's sort of the way we do white glove treatment.
Yeah, it's ditto for us, but we also know it's not scalable, so it's a challenge.
Yeah.
Let's see, I have some online questions here.
Okay.
So this is from Sergio Fuentes, and he says, lots of strategies here. How has the way your organization is organized helped or hindered your migration and data management strategies? And he has a follow-on that says how many staff members are involved in the migration engagement and how many staff members build and manage your service.
Who wants to take a shot at that? Chris?
Two-parter. So first part again?
First part is how has the way your organization, the way it's organized, helped this
Okay.
process or hindered?
I would say helping would be a governance process that we have in place. So if I want to make any kind of settings tweak in the environment, then I have to write up a use case for it. I have to take it to a couple different governance committees that are going to, that also include faculty and researchers and other leaders from the campus. And we take it through that before we, codify it and implement any type of solution. So I think the governance helps with that, because then it's not IT or Chris Clement saying, hey, I'm going to slap quotas on all you guys. So that's definitely helpful. And what was the other part of the question?
How many staff members are involved in a migration engagement, and how many staff members build and manage your service?
Yeah, it's weird. I've done a few migrations, like the Mirror Point one I mentioned to Google. I was involved with that. I did the migration from all the students, 54,000 at the time, from Exchange to Gmail. And we did that with just a handful of people. So about 5 persons, I'd say, total in team. So it really depends on your scale and what are you doing and what type of data are you migrating, and is it a one-for-one, or like you have to do a lot of meetings with folks? Well, that's definitely going to be a bigger challenge for sure. So
from when they did the box migration at IU, they had to write a number of tools to allow the users, as Charlie described, to choose whether they were going to Google or to Microsoft, to choose what to do with their what we called non-personal accounts, moving those to shared drives or team drives. Yeah, so there's a lot. It really depends on how much pain you're willing to take up front versus in the long run. So if you're willing to build those tools and make it easier for the end users, there's a lot more weight on the front end. Any other online right now? Okay, well, oh, here's another in the room.
Todd Raker from Michigan. What are the lessons learned in all this? Right? A lot of people are just going to keep doing this over and over and over again, and the madness will never end unless people really, in institution level, right, take a serious look at it. What's the lesson here, and what do we do to avoid, digging ourselves in yet another hole?
There we go. So for us, as we finished our box, it was a reduction project, right? It wasn't a full migration, but as we completed that project, we did do a lessons learned. The box project was a little bit tricky because they changed the game halfway through by lifting the limits that they were trying to impose. However, because we kept the quotas in place, it wasn't a disaster. We were still able to implement our quotas. But as far as lessons learned, I think for us, we didn't, I'll catch this by saying I started halfway through the box project. There was a bit of a gap in personnel, so it's not the team's fault, but we didn't fully understand our audience. So like the others said, we had, in our case, we had 70 users taking up the top 90% of storage in box. We didn't understand how they were using the platform. So a lot of it was, as everybody else has said, it's researchers. They're just throwing tons of data into box because it's easy, it's collaborative, it syncs. But we, as far as our lessons learned, we needed to do more customer engagement at the beginning of the project to make sure that we understood who was doing what and why. And also, this is a continuing issue actually for us, to understand what the options are and where the gaps are in the options for other solutions or other tools. So we still, in general, have a pretty big gap in services that are collaborative and accessible easily for researchers. We have lots of storage places, but some of them are kind of difficult to get to. You can't, chat or leave comments on things, and people really need that sometimes. So for us, I think a better groundwork would have been resulted in a much more improved process. But we also learned a lot about how we want to handle the Google project. So that's kind of the nice thing about Box, is we have kind of a proving ground for the process. So in that sense, it was actually was helpful to learn the lessons the hard way, I guess.
One thing to add to that. The other thing is, if you're going to deploy a new application that's cloud-based, don't keep making the same mistakes that you keep making all over again, right? I'm behind the 8 ball with Zoom and Google right now. I got to implement retention on our users. It's totally counterproductive for them on their collaboration, and it's one of those tough things that we're just going to have to implement and do. So I would say, don't get yourself in the same fix again. You roll out another application, start out with retention policies, and plan that it's going to be a problem for the future, even if it isn't. And no matter how much data you have when you start, it's never enough when you get towards the end. So.
Yeah, so I think I'm coming to this late to the game. So I have the advantage of seeing what everybody else has done. And I truly believe it's not a storage problem. It is a storage problem, but it's really not. It's about the practices around storage, how people understand what they're doing when they're using the storage, right? So we have compliance issues, we have security issues. So what happens if someone goes and puts something somewhere to share it, right? They've shared it, but have they sort of violated some police security risk? And there's not enough of us to train users. So what I really envision is a way to provide tools that just in time alert the users to something they might be trying to do that would put them at risk. So it doesn't matter. The reason why we get involved as administrators or overseers is because people wanting to do the right thing could accidentally do the wrong thing and expose themselves to a lot of security risk, compliance risk, right? So what I'm really, really hoping for is that at some point we get to a place where we use collective skills and thinking and innovation to give people just-in-time information at the point when they're about to do an action that lets them know what they might be doing inadvertently. And I think that there's no unlimited anything, right?
Right.
So as we've heard, we should put retention in place. And we work at institutions, at Harvard especially, where we have a federated model. So policies are created at the local level that sometimes contradict each other. And so it becomes really difficult to tease out what is allowed and what's not allowed. So for us, something that's helping is that our OGC is coming up with policies that help us to sort of allow people, help us to talk to people about why they should be following certain rules or not.
Did you have something you wanted to? Yeah.
I was just going to add that I think it's really important for everyone to be an advocate for the tools that you need to manage your services adequately and correctly. So the services, Box and Google are obviously our focus, but they're not built with the tools that we need to do what they're asking us to do. And my point is not so much that we're missing the tools, but that we need everyone to gather together to have a solid voice with these companies and say, if you're going to do this, give us the tools. And with that collective voice, we can really make a bigger impact with the things that we need. And to go along with that, when Chris was talking about starting new services, make sure that the service has the management tools that you need as far as setting quotas and things like that, quotas and retention. Make sure that it's established before you start the service. The quotas particularly is not something that we looked at in the past. But now that we all have our eyes open to the situation, if you're going to start a new service, start with quotas.
I would be remiss if I didn't add that when Google announced its end of unlimited storage, that Internet2 pulled together a cloud storage working group. And if anybody's interested in being a part of that conversation, where they have been kind of crowdsourcing ideas to give feedback to Google's and the vendor community about the tools necessary, just stop me or reach out afterwards. Question.
Okay,
Yep.
we have just one question online. How did you overcome API limits when moving from one cloud provider to another? I have the Globus party line, but I'll let you guys.
Yeah.
We rate limited, basically. We were using our clone, and we've established a point where, because we couldn't use Globus, I wish we could. We used our clone and we just rate limited. So we would have people set up for like 3 months worth of transfer. And that was the only way to get around it. And the other thing, I think if we can work with our reps to get our APIs temporarily adjusted with Box, that probably is not going to be a viable option for Google, but we're hoping to use Globus for Google and get around it.
I will say that I have a ringer in the audience, and we could ask Joseph about the API limits on Google Drive.
Hi, everyone. I work at Google, so it doesn't mean I know everything about Google. So. API limits on Google Drive.
Right. Data transfer with Google Drive.
Actually, I don't know the number. I do know they throttle at certain points. So this probably goes to one of the comment the speaker made or the panelist made, like 1 million small files, probably is going to throttle you quite a bit. Large files typically moves pretty smoothly, so that matters. I don't know.
It's an option to request a temporary increase in APIs if a school's doing a big move or something.
The API limit for Google Drive, they are all user quotas. That's my belief. So they are.
So it's not at the institution.
It's not an institutional quota. It's a user, because I think the Globus is signing as an individual user. So the queries are invoked at the user level. I do know there are some institutes or some groups, they were using multiples and try to scale up. And we detect that. Not we, but Google detect that.
So busted if you're multi-threading, huh?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, they will notice there's a spike somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So that's why we have a team called SREs. They're looking at these things.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me phone a friend there. All right. There's another question in the back there.
I will add though, sorry,
go ahead.
I can't give up the opportunity to point out that one of the key things we focused on in the Globus connectors is being cognizant of the limits and working with them, working around them in the sense that we'll back off and do the right thing. So when you do have these multi-hundred terabyte or petabyte scale transfers that might take weeks or months even, it'll run and it'll pick up. So there's a 750 gig limit, I think, for uploading. If you're going to go the other way, right, we'll note that, we'll back off, we'll come back and carry on. So, okay, Mike, go ahead.
Okay, so one question, when you were looking at your storage problem, did you do any kind of an analysis as to whether or not some of your researchers were taking the same source data and copying it multiple times into their own home drive? Because I need this exact same source data. I'm going to copy it there. Now you have 2 copies, 4 copies, and then they told a friend and so on and so on. I just aged everybody with the Breck commercial thing. And then the other, kind of tie-on question to that is, and I think this really speaks to the community kind of voice that you were talking about, is that there's oftentimes authoritative sources of that data, and then we can grab that. It doesn't necessarily change. And sometimes an educating thing might be to say, if this data is a source and you need it to run a couple of these analyses, do you need to store it for 6 years after you've run your analysis? Or the next time, could we use something, I don't know, designed for great data transfer? Maybe a conference would be good for it. And pull it down when you need it. We've actually had this conversation with some people saying you needed to run these things. If we have 5 scientists that need to run against the same thing, let's take one source of data locally and run it. But if you don't need it, then afterwards, let's just pull it down, because maybe the day it would take us to pull down the data again and put it into Scratch may be easier for us to manage than 50 terabytes of source data that you only look at every 7 years. So I'm kind of vamping as well as asking a question, but did you guys look at any of these analysis to see how we can consolidate some of that work to cut down the overall storage?
I can answer that from investigation. Is yes, there is a copy, right? So someone has a local copy and then they're putting a copy in Google, and it serves 2 purposes. That's the only backup copy. So there's a gap there with the backup processes. But also because of COVID, people found themselves in this place where they needed to do something from home and access some of these resources from home. So it was helpful to copy it into Google to allow that access. As to whether they could potentially share the data, what we're hoping is if we gave them Globus, they wouldn't need to copy the data.
So just to add on to what Helen said, as far as I know, we don't have a huge issue with data duplication because they are genuinely sharing it. We have something called special purpose accounts at Berkeley, which are sort of departmental accounts, shared accounts. So for the most part, people are using those accounts and then connecting into them to get what they need. But what we did see is that, well, we know that our researchers have retention rules for grants, and they have to have their data somewhere and it has to be redundant. So they've been using the cloud services for their redundancy. So some groups may have stuff in Google and Box, and that's where you get your duplicate copies for retention reasons or redundancy reasons. So that is something that we haven't necessarily been able to resolve. We also know, this may be useful for you actually, we know that we can get age reports from Box. So Box can tell us this content hasn't been accessed in the past 3 years, 5 years, 1 year. And that has helped us work with our researchers to figure out what they need and don't need, because the ones who don't have retention policies, they can go out and clean out their stuff. And so that was very helpful for us as well. And just a side note about the Box stuff, they, as part of their contract, they are telling us that you can't have cold storage in Box at all. You can't use it for archival or backup purposes. So that's another thing that we're fighting with. We're trying to come to terms with our researchers, because we would like those people to move into something like AWS or Glacier or things like that. But it's tricky because they're worried that they might need something, or like convincing them that that's the right move. And then now with Box lifting our limits, we're just kind of, we're taking a pause on the move at the moment, but we're gonna have to revisit that. And so, yeah, it's, for us, it's less about duplication, it's more about age.
If I may. One, something Sarah touched on there that is often missed in the kind of technical logistical thing is when you move it from a collaborative storage environment like a Google Drive or Box, which is typically paid for centrally, and you're able to move it to Google Cloud Storage or AWS, then the person who's incurring the cost can pay for it. That's a huge deal because it's so hard to disaggregate that otherwise. The other thing I would say is I would make an impassioned plea to the vendors to create tools that allow us to identify those duplicates, even within your own, and even within one platform, much less across platforms.
Yeah, just one thing to add, I saw an administrator notification, I think it was last week or the week before, that Google's introducing shortcuts. So it's going to go through your Drive files, and if it finds that it has duplicates, then it'll make a shortcut and kind of basically put it into one file. So they're making some progress there.
Hey, Bob, if I could just
Yes, yeah, go
add
ahead, Jim.
something there. Very early on in our when we told researchers to start moving their stuff to Box, which was probably about 7 years ago now, we created these non-person accounts. And I think somebody else mentioned the sort of departmental accounts. Really what they amounted to were research group accounts. And we avoided a lot of the duplication that way. And that sort of, those lessons have carried over even as we move to Office 365. The SharePoints, there's, you know, the idea of a departmental SharePoint so that there's a single source of the original data or the raw data, the canonical data to look at, and we don't have a lot of that problem. Now, would I say that it's gone away? I don't know, I doubt it, but that seems to be the way we started off right when we moved to Box in terms of preventing a lot of duplication.
Great, thanks, Jim.
Lev Gorenstein, Purdue University. I just wanted to add, oftentimes we hear we need to convince researchers to do that. Oftentimes researchers don't need convincing. They would love to have their data backed up. They need tools to do it. And if they have to, you know, if a biologist need to go into command line and type rsync, most of them will not do it because it's just too complicated. But give them a point and click with something that they can schedule, you know, Globus timer, and they would do it.
Fair, yeah. I think Helen talked about basically how framing is important and making sure that you're looking at the gaps between the use cases, and too often central IT is looking, you know, some big blob or software as a service that is just the collaboration environment, and then you end up trying to make it work for every conceivable workflow. And you know, talking the question earlier about lessons learned, I think one of the things that none of us has learned is to come up with a map of storage that meets the map of use cases. Too often it's, here's a storage solution, let's force everything into it. And then getting out of them is a big mess. All right, I think we are at time.
Yes, we are. Thank you very much.
We will end on that big mess.